And now, without further ado, we're very welcome. We're very fortunate today to welcome Professor Gabrielle Vigliocco from the University College of London. She's an expert in psycholinguistic, and I really want to keep it short because I really want to hear about her latest research. I'm just going to say that her work is so groundbreaking that I have had to cite her any paper I wrote, especially when I got to any big debate in the literature, noun versus verbs, abstract versus concrete concepts, embodied semantics versus distributional semantics. She was always there. So I'm very much looking forward to hear about the latest venue of research, and I'm going to leave her the floor.
Thank you so much, everybody, for being here, and for Valentina for inviting me, and for these very kind words. So what I'm going to present today is work that we've done in my lab in the last 5-6 years. This is a new talk, so it may be a little rougher in places, and please do ask questions while I'm presenting so that I make sure that I clarify things. Also, it may be too long, but I have bits and pieces that I can cut. Okay, so it's very likely that when language originated, it did originate because in the context of social interaction between hominida at the time, grounded on the need to communicate, rather than instead by a single hominida inventing symbols and then sharing them with others. We know that language is learned in the context of interaction with caregivers, and it's not learned instead, again, by a single child developing an understanding of abstract linguistic symbols. And as adults, also our favorite way to communicate with one another is in social interaction, in face-to-face context. Although, of course, we can enjoy very much other ways of using language, like, for example, listening to a podcast or reading a book. Now, this example illustrates the fact that in general, I would argue that the primary context in which language is indeed originated, developed, and used, or the ecology of language, is face-to-face interaction. However, it is also the case that most of what we know about the cognitive and neural basis of language is based not in this context, but instead in the study of single individuals and single minds during some dealing with language considered as sets of symbols and rules. Now, why maybe this be the case? Well, I would argue that there are a number of reasons for it. The first reason for why this may be the case is related to methodological difficulties. It's really hard, it's really time-consuming to study language in face-to-face situated environments. And even now, in the era of AI, it's still really time-consuming. And we can, go, and I can elaborate a lot more on this. I also think, however, that another reason is this is related to the more reductionist approach that we use in our science, where we decompose complex phenomena. And we do so in order to eliminate contextual elements for the purpose of control. But a lot of issues have been raised to this approach more recently as respect to the need to maintain ecological validity of our studies, and the need indeed to learn to bridge between the lab and the real world. I also think that another reason for why we haven't been looking at situated language as so much is more theoretical. And this is, in a sense, most of our studies take language and consider it in terms of symbols and rules at the population level. This is a system that, and then really what we do in our experiments is to look at how the mind and the brain learns and implements these sets of symbols and so forth. But again, the context in which language is learned and used may not, should not, I would argue, be neglected. And indeed, there's a number of theoretical approaches that argue along these lines. Now, going back to my little cartoon, when we think about what are the differences between language in the context of face-to-face communications versus inside language in terms of the solo individual, we see that there seem to be two main axes of difference here. One that is modality. On one case, we're more interested looking at speech or text in a unimodal way. In the other case, inside the language is accompanied by visual signals, by a host of bodily signals. And the other one is interaction. When we are looking at in the top bottom corner, we have the case in which we are, in a sense, considering people as passive consumers of language. In the top corner, instead, we're looking at individual using, learning language in active social interaction. And the question is, to what extent does this matter? Now, what I'm going to be doing today, and most of the work that we've carried out in the last 5 years, concerns one of these axes, the modality one. And in particular, what we have done is to address the questions of to what extent and how patterns of nonverbal behaviors in face-to-face interaction impact language learning and use. What we are doing now in the lab, and what I'll touch upon at the end of my talk, is the related question of how does coordination between interactants, both at the verbal and non-verbal level, impact on language development and language use? Okay, so when I talk about multimodality, what I mean primarily is linguistic information that is embedded in speech, accompanied by a number of other signals. Signals that draw attention to words, like, for example, the intonational pattern that we have that we impose, that we have in our speech, but also visual signals like big gestures, for example. It's actually kind of hard to gesture with holding two things in my hands. But anyway, so like big gestures, which are rhythmic movements of the hands that follow the intonational pattern of what I'm saying. We have signals that draw attention to reference that are being talked about. For example, pointing to an object in the room or gazing to it. We have signals that can help semantic processing of what is being said. And an example, the typical example here are meaningful or representational gestures, gestures that have an imagistic relationship with the content of the speech. So for example, drawing a round circle with my hands if I'm talking about throwing a ball. And finally also, another type of signal that is 100% always there, correlated with speech, which is how informative the mouth movements that people produce while they're speaking. Of course, these are only some. Body posture, there's a number of other signals, eyebrow, and so forth. The reason why I've highlighted those is because those are the ones that we've been working on the most. Now, what have we done? What we have done in the last in our work is following the following approach. First of all, we thought that we need to characterize what speakers do. So to what extent, as I said, mouth patterns are always present, of course, when you speak. But the other signals, the manual ones, for example, or the gazing patterns, these are not necessarily there. How often do people use them? How do they correlate with one another? So we thought that the first thing we had to do was actually to go in the real world to collect some relatively naturalistic data and indeed characterize the use of these different cues in these more naturalistic contexts for a speaker. Then knowing what is the pattern of use of these different cues, we can design studies that maintain, preserve this naturalistic patterning and that help us understanding the use by an addressee, by a learner and or by a person in their use in learning and processing. And then the final step is, the following step is to bring together the speaker and the addressee and begin to look at how the social interaction, in addition to multimodality, impact the learning and the processing. So what I'm going to do in the talk today is just to walk you through very briefly the corpus that we collected of semi-naturalistic language that allow us to characterize the use of multimodal cues by speakers. But then I'll spend the most of the talk on addressing the question of what are the cues and combinations of cues that are relevant to learning. And here, by language learning, I mean like learning new words. And how are the cues used in language processing? At the end of my talk, I'll touch upon the question of whether, or to what extent the interaction is in fact adding to the individual participants. Okay, so the ECOLANG corpus. I don't know if any of you has ever collected a corpus and in addition to that, decided to make it publicly available. I think that's, you know, a one-in-a-lifetime experience. Beautiful. It always sounds beautiful to have a corpus. I will never repeat it ever again. My life is just too short. And if you're thinking about doing it, go for it. If you want to talk to me about it, I will be delighted to. Anyway, here are some of the people who have been involved, both postdocs and PhD students, as well as a small army of students' assistants who have been helping out with the annotation. So the ECOLANG corpus indeed characterizes or attempts to characterize the ensemble of multimodal behavior by a speaker in a naturalistic interaction. And it's limited, it's only on English. The majority are British English speakers, some are American English speakers. And the number of dyads is not huge, but it is nonetheless, as far as I know, the largest dyadic interaction corpus available at this point. It includes a number of caregiver-child dyads, and the children are 3 to 4 years old. And the choice of this age is motivated on the fact that we wanted to be able to see the use of the full repertoire of different multimodal cues, still in an age in which children are learning words and learning language at a very fast pace. And also, we have a similar number of dyads of 2 adults. And the collection, the way in which we collected the data for both for the child caregiver and the adult is very similar. The corpus is annotated for the speaker and a speaker teacher, and you'll understand in a second what I mean. And it's annotated both for the speech as well as the different multimodal behaviors. The corpus is now publicly available as a digital collection at UCL. Okay, so here is a little information about how we went about collecting the data. It's semi-naturalistic because the situation is quite, it's a referential conversation. And we do have the child and the caregiver sitting at the table, talking about sets of objects in different categories that we give them. And we also impose the fact that some of these objects are known to the child and some of these objects are not known to the child. And we establish what is known and what is not by asking the caregiver ahead of time. So this is collected in the home, and the caregiver are simply asked to talk about these objects in the way they usually do with their children. So as I said, some of the objects are known and some are unknown, which allows us to tap into learning. And also we ask them to talk about the sets of objects when the objects are there in front of them and when they are absent. I'm not going to talk a lot or hardly at all about this manipulation in my talk, but it's an interesting one with respect to looking at using language in a more situated, physically situated or displaced manner. Here are some examples of the objects that we have used in the recording. They come from these 4 categories, and they're all very cool toys, so the children are very happy to sit there for about 40 minutes and continue to talk with their caregiver about them. And here is a little snapshot of one of the interactions.
Cheers on the barbecue.
Yes.
That was our leeks, wasn't it? And what did we do with the parsley?
Then they can go on the barbecue.
That could go on the barbecue, yeah.
And the grape.
Can the grapes go on the barbecue?
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
Oh, they're fruit. That's going in our fruit salad, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay, so very trivial. You know, that's exactly the type of interaction you see between caregiver and children, and that's precisely the point. Here's what we did with the adults. The situation, the setting is very, very similar to what we did with the children, and the rationale for it is because we wanted to be able to compare between the two. In this case, they come to the lab, it's not done at home, but the 2 adults are familiar to one another. So what we did here was to pretty much assign the person who signed up to be the speaker and the teacher. And in this way, we establish an asymmetry in the knowledge of the objects that they are being presented between the 2. Just like for the children, some of the objects are known, some are unknown to the addressee. And the way in which we had the teacher learn about these objects before the recording was to send them videos. There are fun videos like this one, talking about these objects and these are objects that are usually unknown to the type of population, young adults, that participated to the study. Here you go, the cassowary.
Cassowaries have earned themselves a vicious reputation, in part due to their steely gaze, impressive claws, which I'll go more into later, and their large size. Cassowaries are the 2nd heaviest flightless birds, bested only by the ostrich. Unlike their relatives, the emu and the aforementioned ostrich, they don't live in open territory, but rather in the dense forests of northern Australia and Papua New Guinea. There are 3 types of...
Okay. And so on. If you're interested, I'll give you the link for the video so that you can watch them yourself. The instructions we gave to the people was not you need to learn them by heart, was just learn something about them so that you can talk about it to your partner tomorrow when we do the recording. Here there are some of the examples of the generally unknown items that we included. And they are included, and we pre-normed that based also of how interesting they are in such a way that people could talk about it. Okay, and here is a person, one of our participants talking about the cassowary.
They've got like massive claws on their feet. So they only eat like, yeah, so they only actually eat like fruit, like big fruit, but they use it to slice it open. And they're the main way that like big fruit with big seeds, like they're the only birds that can eat seeds that big and stuff. So the only way they get dispersed. But it means that obviously if you get cut by the claws, they can be deadly because they're really sharp and then on these massive bird feet.
She obviously really enjoyed learning about the cassowary. Okay. As I said, I'm not going to go into detail of the corpus, but just to give you a sense of the type of data we have, here is the frequency of the different behaviors in the child-directed and in the adult-directed corpus, part of the corpus, which shows that two things, I guess. One is that indeed we have a lot of data, but the other one is that the non-mandatory behaviors, like all the manual ones, are in fact quite common across the different type of diets. Now, so what the ECOLANG corpus does is indeed to provide us information about these multimodal cues are used in real-world interaction. Now, let's start talking about how the addressees may use these multimodal cues in learning and processing. And let's start with learning. And this is work that have been carried out by a number of people who, Francesco and Jan, were postdoc with me. Now they are at their next destination. Chris is a PhD student, Antonia is now a PhD student, and Harriet is as well. Now, if we think about learning new words, there's a number of different factors that come to the picture. One is what are the learner's characteristics, their working memory, their prior vocabulary, and so on and so forth. Another one is clearly what type of language is used by the teachers. Assuming that indeed learning new words and new concepts during a conversation resemble the way in which people learn in the real world, which I believe it is. Clearly, the way in which things are described, how many times labels are repeated, are really critical. And these have all been well described in the literature. What we're doing here is to add on top of it this multimodal behavior and see how they also support or not the learning. Now, there's a large body of evidence that showing the impact of the caregiver use of individual multimodal cues. Caregiver gazing, caregiver pointing, caregiver making representational gestures. There's some much less work done on how adults learn new words in this more kind of incidental way, naturalistic way. What is missing are studies that bring the different multimodal cues together. Usually, studies focus on a single individual cue without considering others. And also, oftentimes, I mean, what we need are studies that bring together the different predictors, the individual variables, the linguistic, and the multimodal ones. So, the addressees, the child and the person who knew less in our corpus, at the end of the recording also were tested. So for the children, we give them a task where they need to recognize the words included to them, which were unknown. We do a vocabulary testing at the time of recording. We repeat the vocabulary testing a year later. And for the adults, we do working memory and vocabulary testing at the time of the recording. We also, at the end of the recording session, ask them to provide the label for these objects that were unknown. And also we ask them to describe these objects. In this way, we have pretty much 4 different types of dependent variables we can look at. We have label learning in different ways for the child and for the, sorry, let me say on this. How do I go back? Sorry, I'm going, How do I go back? Okay, I'll do it the old-fashioned way. Okay, so we have label learning for both child and adults. We also look at vocabulary growth for the child, and we have also a measure of concept learning for the adult. Now, for the sake of my presentation, I'm going to focus only on label learning because it's shared between childs and adults. For the children, this is tested using a picture word matching score. The child hears one of the words and has to choose the one that corresponds to the picture that corresponds to that word. For the adults, they were asked to name the object, and we developed a measure of naming accuracy for that. So we carried out analysis, regression analysis, where we included the individual predictors that we have, the number of linguistic predictors. There are all things that have been shown in previous studies to be important for learning words. And then we include all of our multimodal predictors. And you have some details of the way we went about doing that. So first of all, I'm going to organize all the slides of the results are organized by Q, what kind of predictor is affecting, and on top is always going to be the child, and bottom is always going to be the adults. So here are the individual linguistic variables that are important. For the child, we see that the previous vocabulary matter, also the length, the complexity of the word matter. This is good. This is like a sanity check. We know that these things matter and they should matter. And here we are. We see that they have an impact. How many times the teacher repeated the label is important for the adults. And also for the adults, we see that the length, the mean length of utterance is important, such that for longer utterances, if the label was embedded in longer utterances, they were less likely to learn, which we can discuss later, is also already in the literature. What I want to get to is the multimodal cues. Here is prosody. We see that the pitch, whether the caregiver is using a higher pitch, matters for the children, which is good. This also is present in the literature, and it's related to child-directed language. It's one of the functions of child-directed language. We also see that this effect of higher pitch is more important if the caregiver is also pointing to the object itself when producing the word with higher pitch. So kind of emphasizing, drawing attention to the label, drawing attention to the referent at the same time helps more. For the adults, there's no effect of prosody. Again, effect probably related to indeed the difference between child-directed register versus inside adult-directed register. What about points? Yeah? No, absolutely. They were not even informed that they would have been tested at the end, for that matter. It's really incidental learning, which I believe really mimics, well, really, yeah, that's a big word, mimics the way in which this occurs in real life. We learn things, you know, from others in an incidental way. That's a primary way in which children learn new labels and new concepts from their caregivers. And these are intermixed between words that they already know, of course. So I think, yeah, this was an attempt to mimic that as much as possible. Points. So what we see for the children, yeah? So what I can tell you, so we did ask everybody who contributed to the corpus before doing the recording to describe the designated teacher speaker, to describe how they would do an homeland. Okay, exactly, to get kind of a baseline. We decided not to use it because we realized that what we could do was to use to compare how they talk about unknown to known. And in fact, what you see is that for the caregiver is using higher pitch when they are talking about unknown words than when they are talking about words. But I cannot answer your question because the homelet thingy is still there. Okay. Someone will do it eventually. Okay, so this is, we see that it's especially if there is a point, that points are important for children in combination with eye pitch. We also see that caregiver tend to use higher pitch, and this supports learning. For when this supports learning more when their speech is lexically diverse. So in a sense, I will take this as an indication of less rich. And we will get to it later again. For the adults, what we do see is a main effect of points. So adults are more likely to learn the label if the teacher is in fact pointing at it. Representational gestures. So what we do see for the children is that indeed representational gestures are important and they give a benefit, but this benefit is primarily for weaker learners, people who have a lower vocabulary. For the adults we see, so surprisingly, I found these results really interesting because to see these parallels between children and adults, I didn't have any hypothesis at the beginning. And so what we see with the adults is a similar pattern where the representational gestures lead to better learning for people who have poorer working memory. So if the learner is stronger, the representational gestures are not doing very much. But for weaker learners, instead, they bring about a benefit. The story is completely different for another behaviors that was extremely common in the corpus, primarily because these objects were provided, they were on the table during the interaction, and therefore the caregiver/teacher tended to manipulate them quite a bit. And what we see is that for these, we call them object manipulations, and what we see is that for children, these are actually detrimental for children, again, who are somewhat weaker learners that have lower vocabulary. We do see an effect that is related also in the adults, in the adults, such that here object manipulations are detrimental, especially when the language, they do not provide enough tokens of the label itself. They do not repeat the label sufficiently. Now, there's this very interesting pattern. I'm going to get in a second to providing a speculation for why we see this difference between something that is detrimental and beneficial. And I'm going to do it in the context of a kind of a grand summary that brings together the 4 dependent variables that we had here, that is vocabulary growth for children, as well as adult concept learning. What I found remarkable is that there's a pretty large consistency in the results across tasks and also across children and adults. So for pitch, we see that pitch has a role primarily for children, a beneficial role. We do not see an impact on adults, but in concept learning, where it has a detrimental effect, and we can talk about it later, I think it's related to what kind of content accompanies higher pitch in the adult speech. But if we look at points, we see that, and representational gestures, across the board, they have a beneficial effect. Both of them, and in particular representational gestures, also do not have a primary role, but a supportive role. Namely, if the learner is weak for some reason, or if the language used by the caregiver and by the teacher is not as good as it could be, less lexically diverse, less repetitions of the labels and so forth, representational gestures seem to come to the rescue. Object manipulations instead have, across the board, a detrimental effect. By the way, the light gray are trends and non-significant effects. Now, why would we see this difference between some manual cues like points and representational gesture providing a benefit and instead object manipulations having a negative effect? Well, my speculation is that all of these manual cues are semantically related to the content being expressed in terms of directing attention to the object, this is points and object manipulations, or providing information, semantic information about the object. The fundamental difference between point and representational gestures on the one hand and object manipulation is the temporal coordination between the actual speech, and in particular when the label is produced or the associated words are produced, and the manual feature itself. For points and representational gestures, there is a very tight temporal relationship between this manual signal and the speech. They are, the timing between the two is very short, in the order of 200 milliseconds, and they are systematically like that. Object manipulations, no, they can kind of last over a number of utterances and do not have this timing coupling with the speech. And the idea, therefore, is for object manipulations, these are processed separately. You have two separate streams of processings that are going on at the same time. And therefore, if you do have language that is not as good or a learner that is weaker for some reason, you are in a dual task situation, and that's detrimental. Whereas instead, for the points and the representational gestures, these are integrated with the speech. We also see that gaze doesn't have any effect systematically across the board, which is also compatible, actually, in a large part with the previous literature, where indeed the gaze that matters is the joint gaze between the teacher, caregiver, and the learner, or the gaze by the learner, not so much the gaze by the speaker. Okay, so just to summarize these results, we see that indeed multimodal cues are relevant to language learning. We see that learners use them to learn new words. There's, to me, a striking similarity between the children and the adults, except for prosody. We also have that overall, the manual cues have a complementary role. They don't seem to have, we don't see main effects. We see especially them in interaction, but points. Also, we have this kind of dissociation between those cues that are both semantically and temporally aligned with the speech that support, and those that instead are not and that hinder. Okay, so are these cues used and how in language processing? 10 minutes? 15 minutes? Okay, so I'll close with, go, I need to speed up. Okay, we're switching gears here. Here we're not looking at data from the corpus anymore, but the corpus is in fact informing our selection of stimuli. Now, a prevalent or a kind of a common theoretical position in language comprehension is that, you know, the addressees constantly predict the next words in a sentence, and there's plenty of demonstrations that this is the case. And we see this effect of prediction in the EEG signal, for example, in the N400, that actually has been considered, maybe in an exaggerated way, a biomarker of prediction and processing difficulty. You do see a larger N400 for words that are more difficult to integrate in the previous context, whereas instead the more predictable words produce smaller N400. Previous work has shown that different multimodal cues in isolation also impact the N400. And we have seen this for prosodic stress, for representational gestures, for bit gestures, and also for mouth movements. But it is also the case that most prior studies to this one used artificial stimuli, sometimes creating these artificial incongruencies between the speech and one of the cues, like having gesture for something else associated to the speech, or oftentimes that you wouldn't see, if gestures were manipulated, you wouldn't see the face of the speaker. And also, just like for studies looking at learning, we have that these previous studies have looked at single cues in isolation and not at them together. So we carried out a couple of EEG studies where, here's the first one, where we used we use short passages in this case that were taken from the British national corpus, the spoken part of it, and we asked an actress to read and acted them in a natural way. And we collected EEG from participants while watching
Add the
this
taco
video.
sauce, olive oil and spring onions. Garnish with lime slices and serve piled up in a dish.
Okay, so these were our video clips. What we did was to go through a painful process of quantifying word by word for content words. We didn't do this for function words, different cues. So we quantified the linguistic predictability of the next word in terms of surprisal. And we derived the surprisal measure from just language models. And we did try different type of language models, and that's a topic for another talk. For today, what we use was very, very simple language models that take a very limited context, like n-grams. Also, then for each word, we quantified whether there was a meaningful gesture or a bit gesture. We measured the F0 and hence the pitch for each word. And then for each word, we derive a measure of mouth informativeness that was measured, in fact, in terms of how easy it was for another group of participants to guess that words just by lip reading. First, what we did was to analyze the data in order to identify the time window in which surprise had the largest effect. And you see it here, and this coincide, in fact, we didn't have necessarily the expectation we would. We thought we would see an N400, but it was not necessarily the case. We did see an N400, in fact. Then what we do is in this time window to look at whether any of our multimodal cues have an effect. And the logic here is that this is the time window in which the semantics of the word is being processed, the linguistic information is being processed, and the question we are asking is to what extent the multimodal cues impact on the linguistic processing of the word. Okay, I'm going to show you graphs like this now, where you have on the y-axis the amplitude of the EEG signal, and then we will look at the different predictors. So first of all, we saw that indeed for words that are more surprising, more surprising and therefore less predictable in text, having higher pitch is helpful. We also see that the same is true with respect to meaningful gestures. So if a less predictable word is accompanied by a meaningful gesture, then the processing is faster. Sorry, not the processing is faster, the N400 is reduced. On the other hand, we see that bit gestures, rather than reducing, they do enhance the N400 signal, which we take to indicate that what they do is to enhance the saliency of that specific word, making it more standing out. we also see a number of relatively interesting interactions between the cues. So we see that we see a reduction of the N for 100 when words had both higher pitch and they were presented with a meaningful gesture. Also a reduction of the N for 100 when the words had more informative mouth movements and also a meaningful gesture, but also a reduction when instead of a meaningful gesture, they were accompanied by a big gesture. So I'm not going to dwell into these the specific results. The general point is really that we have these adaptations that are very dynamic, where these multimodal cues are coming in the processing in this immediate way and affect when they are there, when they are present, the processing itself. So we couldn't believe these results. So of course we replicated it. We replicated it with different materials. And in this case also, we decided to do the same study, both with L1 speakers as well as with a group of L2 speakers. This is a very well-controlled group of L2 speakers. These are all Chinese students at UCL. They all have pretty much the same level of English and the same daily exposure to the language, more or less the same age and so forth. Here in this case, we used also longer passages.
But one person here knew him differently to the rest of us, and the family would like to invite him now to read a short passage chosen from the book Dr. Rafferty was reading when he died.
It's a Sherlock Holmes something. So first of all, I should say that we replicated the results for the L1 speakers. Then for the L2 speakers, what we saw is that, first of all, they have this effect of surprisal later, and this is also documented in the literature. Overall, when it comes to the multimodal cues, we see that they use them, but they use them less than the L1 speakers. And this is true across the different cues. And it's perhaps not so surprising. They've been exposed less to that language. What is interesting, however, is that there are two cues that are, in fact, used more by the L2 speakers than the L1 speakers for less predictable words. And these are the meaningful gestures and the mouth movements. One is providing information about the meaning, the other one is helping processing the word. I'd also like to notice that the mouth movements are kind of did not really have any major effect in L1. So in a sense, what we see here is that the L2 speakers are using the multimodal cues in a smarter way for their level of proficiency. So what we see is that indeed the multimodal cues are used in processing by L1 and L2 comprehenders. These cues are dynamically integrated with the speech and impact word level prediction. We see that the different cues impact word level prediction in different ways. So if you take the meaningful gesture and the big gestures, we see that they have an opposite effect on the R400, which is actually very interesting. It shows that it's not just the fact that if you see someone moving while they're speaking, you're paying more attention. There's an arousal effect or something like that. And also, we see that L1 and L2 comprehenders both use these cues, but in different ways. Okay, how much time do I still have? None. 5 max. So I'm going to skip. I had a part on, let me do it this way. We can talk about it later if you're interested. But I'm going to skip it because really I want to get to the final part. So what I've done so far is to show how, indeed, speakers use, and in particular, people use these cues, both in learning and in processing. Now, does the social interaction add anything to it? This is all, we just started to address this question. I just got 2 grants to do it. But what I'd like to do is to tell you about an experiment that we did with Sara De Felice, a PhD student supervised by both myself and Antonia Hamilton, that shows how actually the interaction adds something. So we're back to our friend, the cassowary. We used in this case, we had people learn new concepts, and these are pretty much the same concepts that we used in the corpus study. And in particular, what we have is that first they participate in a study in which there's a teacher, Sarah, telling about features of these concepts, and then they have a quiz. But here's the specifics of the design of these studies. We manipulated both social contingency as well as social richness. And it's in particular the social contingency manipulation that is important. What we did was to have 2 conditions, and these were within participants. One was that in which Sarah was teaching the concept to 2D participant directly. The other condition instead, the participant was watching a video of Sarah teaching that concept to the previous participant. So in this way, we can have a comparison between live and recorded, and everything that Sarah does is exactly the same, as well as any interaction is exactly the same. It's just that in one case, the subject in the experiment is actively involved. In the other case, it's passively involved. We also manipulated whether the participant could see both the face and the hands of Sarah, and Sarah was manipulating the object, which you shouldn't have, but we didn't know at that point what the impact of object manipulation was. And in another case, instead, they could only see the hands. Now, this was a study done during the pandemic. It was done over Zoom, but she has replicated these results also in person in clever experiments in which she has 2 participants at the time. And in one case, she's teaching to one, and in another case, she's teaching to the other. And here is the basic result, which is relatively simple. What we do see is a major effect of the social contingency. If the participant is actively engaged, then the learning is better than if the participant is only passively engaged. And this is true in both conditions. It's also the case that, but this is a weaker effect, if they see both the face and the hands, they were performing better. So this study doesn't tell us anything about the specific cues and what is their role, but it does tell us that interaction, in fact, may play a role, and the contingencies that are present in interaction do. Okay, so to summarize, we see that also social interaction impact learning. And it is, if you invite me again in 2 years' time, I'll tell you what the role of coordination is. But let me go back to my initial slide. So I think that what we have shown so far is that indeed the patterns of nonverbal behaviors in face-to-face interaction do impact indeed the way in which we use language and the way in which we learn language, and how this coordination plays a role is what needs to establish next. There's also 2 other questions that to me are incredibly important when we start thinking about language in this situated manner. One is, well, you know, children indeed learn language in this social situated context and so forth. But at some point, children indeed learn to read. They learn to listen to a podcast. They learn to, in fact, process language in a more kind of abstracted way, in a more displaced manner. How does this process take place? And the other question is, well, I mean, we have been taking for granted that indeed the process of the neural and cognitive processes involved in listening to language or reading language are the same as in a situated context. But this is actually, I mean, this is something that I believe needs to be tested. Okay, so, and I want just to close with a picture of my lab and the QR codes for both my website and for the ECOLANG corpus, because one of my PhD students yesterday scolded me because I only put the web link. And they say, oh, but nobody's going to note your link. Okay, put the QR code. And I'm looking at her, showing my age, thinking, oh, that's a good idea. And she did it, and she gave me the QR codes. So there they are. Thank you very much for listening.